Shot to pieces, up in flames, free-falling. Chinese-US relations do have some similarities with the alleged Chinese spy balloon which the US downed over South Carolina on Saturday following sightings of the balloon across the states. The US claims that it was likely used to spy on American military bases, whilst China says it was a weather balloon that drifted off course. Whatever the origins, the diplomatic strain is definitely being felt. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has delayed his visit to China, intended to be the first of any American official to Beijing in 5 years. This is the latest episode in the worsening of Chinese-American relations, which has soured as a result of China's standoff with Taiwan, as well as the increased autocracy of Xi Jinping and a long-running trade war between the two countries. Could this be the start of a new Cold War? Was Blinken's trip cancelled because of the balloon, or is there something else at play? Is there any hope for Chinese-US relations?
So let's get to it. Is there any hope for U.S.-Chinese relations? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance, and we pick it up from there. So, Carice, please take the lead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, Xi toned down the tough rhetoric after he met with Biden in November in the G20 in Bali. And now the current economic stress in China is so severe that Beijing has ratcheted back a lot of the aggressive behavior of its diplomats. And then once the U.S. ups its game and ensures it can stay ahead in advanced cutting-edge technologies like nano, quantum, and semiconductors, and has enough engineers to hold that lead, I think the U.S. will probably feel a lot better about improving relations.
And it's all about feeling just a tiny bit better when it comes to hardcore diplomacy, isn't it? Jonathan Schanzer, please, your take.
Sure. My take is that the U.S. and China are undeniably on a collision course. This is exactly what we hear from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from the White House, day in and day out. We are now in a new era of great power competition. It is marked by the kind of audacious actions taken by the Chinese in the skies over northern United States, but also the theft of intellectual property and a genocide that's happening on their own soil. The only hope right now is mutually assured economic destruction. We are very reliant on the Chinese. That's the only caveat here right now.
And last but not least, Dan Perry, your thoughts?
I think there is certainly hope. There's certainly hope that the U.S. and China will not go to war, but the two countries are very much established as rivals, not only because of very strange balloons, but also a whole variety of factors ranging from tensions over Taiwan and zones of influence in the South China Sea to industrial competition that leads to espionage of every conceivable kind, to the very fact that in addition to trade and currency pressures, the two countries have radically different forms of government and are in the midst of a Cold War between the liberal democracies of the West and despotic regimes in an informal alliance.
Okay, and on that note, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Jonathan, I do want to begin with you. Why did the Biden administration decide to go public with this alleged spying balloon and not alleged previous ones? Why now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a very simple answer, and that is that there were researchers that found this balloon in the sky. They made it public, and it became a public security nightmare for the administration. I think they probably would have rather keep things under kind of behind closed doors and in the shadows. Apparently, from what we hear, they called in Chinese diplomats to the State Department in the middle of last week after it was already found. The Chinese did not have a satisfactory answer. In the meantime, additional questions continue to swim, in particular on social media, sparking a real outrage among the national security community and those that watch the defense space.
And in fact, you could kind of turn a question on its head. One very interesting thing to wonder is why the previous three cases during the Trump administration were not made public. I do not know if actually no one saw them. I don't know if they took any action to suppress the information, but it is rather odd and certainly been sort of contrast to the belligerence that the administration of Trump showed towards China for at least part of his tenure.
It is curious as to why as you noted, Mr. Perry, that they didn't make it public. Now there's a competition between the Democrats and the Republicans who is tougher on China, and they're using every action, every aspect. I mean, we're looking at it here from Israel and seeing that it seems to be a distraction between Republicans and Democrats instead of a sort of unified approach that might be more effective with China.
But from the Chinese standpoint, was the Biden administration a reaction or response too cautious or over dramatic, Carice?
It looks to me, I wonder if that balloon is a tool on the part of the Chinese. I don't know how much the Blinken visit was going to be welcome at this time when the economy is in such a disastrous situation like it hasn't been for decades. Huge unemployment, tremendous suffering by the population in a kind of subprime version of real estate closures. And at the same time, the hospitals remain absolutely flooded with serious fever cases of COVID. So, to what extent does Beijing really want that visit to take place? And did this turn out in their favor?
But circling back, Jonathan, before we talk about ramifications, do we know if American intelligence was compromised? You suggested that it was not a proactive decision to go public with it, but rather carried away because of the way it was discovered or brought up. Is Washington disguising to an extent the scope and scale of what was compromised?
Well, look, I think there's been a lot of speculation up until now, anyway, about what exactly that balloon was trying to watch. I think the broad assumption is that we've got ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile fields, and silos across places like Montana and South Dakota and Idaho, and it's quite possible actually that the Chinese have been mapping out these military installations. This would, of course, be the installations that would likely be triggered in the event of a broad-scale war. So it could be, and again, I think we have to, we don't know what was on that balloon. It's been shot down. We don't know what's been recovered, but it's quite possible that it was picking up a lot of very sensitive signals and geospatial intelligence.
Dan, do you think that the spying balloon was, in a sense, a Chinese trial balloon, as in to test the American response or lack thereof, and not actually, intelligence gathering, or not just?
I mean, it's hard to believe that balloons in this day and age are needed for intelligence gathering. I understand that there's some version of an explanation, but I cannot divine what was on their minds. I just think it's a little bit unfortunate that when the world, in fact, needs cooperation between these two countries and they need understanding between the U.S. and China, that something like this should happen, which does not further those goals. And in particular, when China reacts to it with what appear to be transparent, brazen, and even preposterous lies, when it was very clear that the balloon was navigating, not lost off course, but navigating over sensitive sites in Montana and making its way across the entire country. Their highly mendacious response, I think, will serve to further demonize China in the eyes of the American public, and that's unfortunate.
Carice, do you think this entire saga or the American reaction will hinder diplomatic progress vis-a-vis Beijing, or is diplomacy per se is merely hindering armed conflict?
Diplomacy hindering armed conflict, I don't understand, but I do believe that from Beijing's perspective, this probably was a successful and perhaps opportunistic development, in that regardless of whether or not whatever the balloon was intended to do, I think it managed to achieve far more, as I said, by creating so much dissonance in Washington and ending, having Blinken cancel the trip and not having it come from Beijing. So I think for them, it's considered a win. However, in the longer term, there's going to be ongoing diplomacy, and I think a much less aggressive, obviously, and rhetorically aggressive behavior from Beijing in order to calm the waters so it can get its domestic situation back in order.
And speaking to that point exactly, Jonathan, at what point should the West exercise more than just rhetoric power?
Look, I think, first of all, we did shoot down the balloon at the end of the day, so it's already gone on rhetoric, and I think that was important action taken. I do think there are questions about whether we should have waited that long. There may have been concerns about gases or biological elements or unknown elements that may have been contained within the balloon. And I think it's for that reason that the leadership at the Pentagon waited until it was over the water. But I do think that it's important to zoom out for a second and just look at the broader context, right? The Chinese have been stealing billions and billions of dollars in intellectual property here in the United States. They have unregistered spies that are just crawling all over the country. There is industrial espionage that's taking place. There's this Belt and Road Initiative where the Chinese are trying to outmuscle and outflank the United States in every possible arena. There's a rare earth battle that's going on. I mean, the list goes on. And so I do think that this was kind of a clarifying moment for the United States here. I think there was a sense maybe that we cannot deny that this great power competition is heating up, and that perhaps we are facing an adversary right now that is far more brazen than anything that we may have expected previously. And so this may be that moment, a wake-up call, if you will, for Washington to get its priorities straight.
Dan, is anyone waking up?
No, I very much agree. I mean, I think mostly this is either a laughable mistake or some version of messaging, because, it is more or less fair enough that the countries spy on each other. And as has been said, industrial and strategic espionage doesn't shock anyone. But the fact that it was done in this particular way, in such a brazen way, and the reaction, as I say, was so mendacious and in your face, I think does potentially serve as a wake-up call that China means business when it sees itself as in a Cold War rivalry with the U.S.
So, Carice, can we define it as the start of a Cold War, or are we in the middle of it?
The term Cold War is a bit problematic because it's a totally different world. And the Cold War refers to a situation where the economies were not at all interlinked. And as was mentioned earlier, in the current situation, they're deeply intertwined. And one of the pressures that the U.S. faces is China's ability to gain access and control over a lot of key minerals and that are necessary for those semiconductors that I talked about earlier, and cobalt, and as was mentioned, rare earths. So,
but by the way, I have to say, another definition of Cold War is a hostility without a shooting war. And I think when you have that, plus you have interlinked economies, then things are very dangerous indeed, because you can have, obviously, currency wars and all kinds of other shenanigans.
Okay, so we have a few minutes to find a new definition to the ongoing war between China and the U.S. A quick break, and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Jonathan Schnazner, Carice Witte, and Dan Perry. Thank you very much for staying with us. We're also, of course, staying on topic. But before we get back to our conversation, you all mentioned that it was supposed to be a weekend of high diplomacy here, but the U.S. top diplomat's canceling his visit to Beijing, not shutting the door quite yet. Let's take a listen.
In my call today with Director Wang Yi, I made clear that the presence of this surveillance balloon in U.S. airspace is a clear violation of U.S. sovereignty and international law, that it's an irresponsible act, and that the PRC's decision to take this action on the eve of my planned visit is detrimental to the substantive discussions that we were prepared to have. I told Director Wang that the United States remains committed to diplomatic engagement with China, and that I plan to visit Beijing when conditions allow. In the meantime, the United States will continue to maintain open lines of communication with China, including to address this ongoing incident.
Well, Carice did address that earlier, but let's get deeper to it. Was the balloon the real reason or merely the excuse for the cancellation of Blinken's visit? Another quick fire round, and we pick it up from there. Jonathan, take the lead, please.
Yeah, look, I think this administration's default position is diplomacy. So I think it very much wanted to go, if they wanted Blinken to go to China, I think they wanted the engagement and to see if they could begin to establish a modus vivendi between the United States and China. It obviously is not working. At least up until now. I think the Chinese continue to find ways to provoke the United States. I think it left Blinken and President Biden with virtually no choice but to cancel in light of what just happened. Otherwise, it would have been an embarrassment.
Dan Perry.
The U.S. clearly wanted the visit, so the balloon is indeed the reason. The more interesting question is China. They had to have known that it would likely be discovered and it would scuttle the plan. So if they wanted to, fine. If not, it does raise concerns about decision-making in Beijing, and one might suspect that the various branches are even not coordinated, and the whole thing is a mess, which is, of course, something that would neutralize one of the main advantages of dealing with a dictatorship, that at least you know more or less what to expect.
And for you, Carice, it's not an excuse necessarily for Washington, but definitely an attempt to foil the visit on behalf of China, right?
I don't know if I'd use the word foil, but I do think that it was bad timing. I agree with Jonathan that the U.S. is interested in diplomacy, that they put a lot of effort, and climate change, for example, is a huge factor for the United States and wants to work together with China. But we also know that Xi Jinping is planning to come to the United States for APEC in later this year, which will take place in Florida. So I think this was an effort on China's part to slow things down.
And let's feel free to interact, of course. Is Washington's China policy working, Dan?
Look, the U.S. has a huge trade deficit with China. I don't think it's very happy about that. The U.S. feels vulnerable because China holds $1 trillion in U.S. debt, and they're not too happy about that. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to Taiwan. All this stuff, I think, is a little bit in the background, and issues that are strategic around the South China Sea, but in particular Taiwan, are probably the main thing. The only thing that truly can blow up this standoff between the U.S. and China is that, and that depends really on Xi. His past bellicosity, as Clarice said, seems to have subsided somewhat, probably because they are experiencing economic difficulty.
Jonathan, is the White House taking the right approach? Is Biden too soft on the Chinese, as GOP leaders argue?
I'm not sure we have a China policy yet, if I'm going to be really honest. I think that, 20, 30 years ago, I think our approach was to go all in, buying cheap Chinese products and getting cheap Chinese labor, collaborating as much as possible, and offering the opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to engage more with the West and to become responsible global stakeholders. That has clearly failed. Now we're in the process of wagging our finger at a whole bunch of other allies, telling them not to engage as we did for the last several decades, asking them to curb their engagement with the Chinese while we still have massive amounts of business. Just about every product you can buy on Amazon is made in China. As we just heard, they're holding massive amounts of American debt. We've got a lot of work to do ourselves if the goal is to decouple, as it's often said. I'm not seeing it happen. I see some moves in the right direction, but I don't see a full recalibration yet. And I think we may begin to see more of it now that we've just had this wake-up call in the shape of a balloon over the northern United States.
I have to say maybe another issue is the dashing of U.S. hopes that China can become a player that, although it has very much a different system that the U.S. does not agree with, can be an ally in geostrategic issues. And we see very clearly what I called before an informal alliance of despotisms as regards Russia today, as regards Iran for the past decade or more, really. There's almost no way to rope in China into anything resembling a global consensus that the U.S. will find reasonable, and that's a major problem.
At the same time, Xi Jinping has said he wants to reshape global governance to make the world more conducive to China's interests. Well, and I think it's definitely incumbent upon democracies and like-minded countries to work together, in spite of the fact that, yes, the United States holds different standards for itself as it does for others. Nonetheless, I think it's in everyone's interest to cooperate. And I do agree with Jonathan that the policy is in development. And it's very important to keep those allies and partners closely informed so we can work together.
The post-war order was really created by the West, led by the U.S. It cannot be denied that when the U.S. hoped to rope China into that world order, it was a world order of its own making and to a degree very convenient to the West. Indeed, China wants something completely different, and the implications societally, culturally, economically, geopolitically are enormous, and that's a challenge for the U.S. and the West.
But if we want to test this alluring ability of each side, Indonesia is a perfect battlefront to look at, and it seems that China got edged there. Jonathan.
Look, I think this is certainly a, let's call it a seesaw battle right now between the United States and China. You can see that the U.S. is able to edge the Chinese out in certain key jurisdictions. I think, by the way, Israel's a great example of this, that Israel made the mistake of engaging a bit too aggressively with the Chinese, got its wrist slapped, and now there appears to be really full-throated cooperation, or certainly more cooperation than we've seen in the past, and China's winning fewer tenders. And I think that's happening in a lot of places around the Middle East and beyond. And so there is a bit of a seesaw battle. The only question is, has China jumped out to a bit too much of a lead? I think that really is the concern. They've been playing this game for quite a long time before the United States woke up.
I think it would help to put things in.
Look at what happened in the Philippines, where Marcos was the first in Asia to go to visit Beijing. And then a month later, Lloyd Austin was in the Philippines securing bases as close on islands as close to Taiwan as possible and as close to the Spratly Islands as possible. So I don't think it's so clear how things are developing. There's movement by both the U.S. and China, and it's definitely an ongoing competition.
I would also note that we can do a disservice by pretending that we're talking about two equal players on the world stage. Nonetheless, China has shown spectacular economic growth. There's no discussion about that. But at the same time, where that growth brought it to is this: with about a sixth of the world's population, it accounts for about a sixth of the world's economy. The U.S., with less than 5% of the world's population, I think still accounts for a third of the world economy. So China's catching up, but in nominal terms, it has a very, very long way to go.
Okay, we're out of time. Definitely not out of passion, nor out of topics to discuss. So we are hoping to see you all back again on the show soon. Carice Witte, Jonathan Schnazner and Perry, thank you very much for this. To be continued. No other way to put it.